I want you to imagine a glass sphere. It is exactly 4 feet in diameter. Now imagine climbing inside it, but you cannot sit down. You have to lay on your back, curl your knees up to your ears, and assume the fetal position. Once you are wedged in, a steel door closes behind you. You are now suspended underneath the belly of a B-17 bomber, 25,000 feet in the air. The temperature outside is 40 degrees below zero. The wind is screaming past you at 200 miles per hour. And because the sphere is so small, there is no room for a parachute. You left it upstairs in the fuselage. You are dangling in the void, spinning on hydraulic gears, looking directly down at the enemy. When the anti-aircraft fire, the flak, starts exploding, you do not look out at it. You look down into the throat of the cannons, trying to kill you. This was the station of the ball turret gunner. Critics called it a glass coffin. Crews called it the bubble. But to the men who flew in it, it was simply the most dangerous carnival ride in human history. To understand why the Army Air Forces built a device this terrifying, we have to look at the engineering problem they faced in 1940. 1. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be invincible. It had machine guns in the nose, the tail, the waist, and the roof. But the German Luftwaffe pilots were smart. They quickly realized that the B-17 had a blind spot, the belly. If a German fighter attacked from directly below, the American gunners could not see him, let alone shoot him. The Germans were gutting the bombers from the underside. The engineers needed to put a gun turret on the bottom of the plane, but there was a problem: ground clearance. The B-17 sat low to the ground. A standard turret would scrape the runway during takeoff. So the Sperry Corporation invented the ventral ball turret. It was a marvel of miniaturization, a perfect aluminum and plexiglass sphere that hung from a gimbal. It could rotate 360 degrees horizontally and 90 degrees vertically. It carried 250 caliber machine guns with 500 rounds of ammunition per gun. But the machine dictated the man. You could not be a linebacker and fit in a ball turret. You could not be tall. The Army Air Forces looked for men who were 5'4", maybe 5'6", weighing 130 pounds. They were often the youngest men on the crew, the little guys. And once the mission started, they were the most isolated. The pilot and co-pilot sat together. The waist gunners stood back to back. The radio operator was near the engineer. But the ball turret gunner, he was physically separated from the hull. He was hanging outside the airplane, watching the earth rotate beneath his boots. The suicide aspect of this position was not just about enemy fire. It was about the design of the escape mechanism. The tail gunner, if he needed to bail out, could clip on his parachute, jettison the escape hatch, and roll out. It took 10 seconds. For the ball turret gunner, escaping a doomed aircraft was a complex mechanical procedure. Remember, there was no room for the parachute inside the ball. The gunner wore a safety harness, but the actual parachute pack was stowed inside the bomber's fuselage, just outside the turret door. Here is the escape procedure. First, center the turret. You had to use the electric motors to rotate the ball until the guns were pointing straight down. This aligned the door with the entry hatch in the fuselage. Second, open the door. You had to unlatch the steel door behind your head. Third, climb out. You had to pull yourself up out of the fetal position into the dark fuselage of the plane. Fourth, locate the chute. You had to find your parachute pack in the chaos of a crashing plane. Fifth, clip on. You had to attach the pack to your harness. Sixth, jump. You had to run to the waist window or the main door and bail out. Now imagine trying to do that while the plane is spinning burning, or filling with smoke. And there was a fatal flaw. The turret relied on the plane's electrical system. If the bomber took a hit and lost power, the electric motors in the turret died. And if the power died, while the guns were pointed at an angle, say firing at a fighter at 3 o'clock, the door would be blocked by the fuselage wall. The gunner was trapped. He could not rotate the ball to align the door. There was a manual hand crank, but it was slow, and the leverage was terrible. If the plane was going down and the power was out, the ball turret gunner was effectively sealed inside. There was a fear greater than flak, greater than fighters, greater than fire. The belly landing. Every B-17 gunner knew the geometry of his aircraft. The ball turret hung below the fuselage. If the landing gear worked, the turret had about 15 inches of clearance above the runway. But combat damage often destroyed the hydraulic lines that lowered the wheels. If a B-17 had to make a wheels-up landing, a belly landing, the aircraft would skid along the ground on its fuselage. The lowest point of the fuselage was the ball turret. If the gunner was inside the ball during a belly landing, he would be crushed between the concrete of the runway and the aluminum of the aircraft. Standard operating procedure stated that if the plane was damaged, the gunner was supposed to climb out of the turret immediately. But what if the door was jammed? What if the power was out and the turret was stuck at an angle? There were tools available to jettison the turret, to use a wrench to undo the bolts and drop the entire ball from the plane. But this took time, and a calm flight engineer, war correspondent Andy Rooney, described a B-17 returning to base in England. The landing gear was destroyed. The ball turret gunner was trapped. The door mechanism had been smashed by flak. The turret could not be jettisoned. The pilot had to land. He had fuel running out. He had wounded men on board. Rooney described the radio chatter. The pilot talking to the trapped gunner. The gunner knowing exactly what was about to happen. The plane coming in. The sound of the turret scraping the tarmac. That scenario haunted every man who ever climbed into that sphere. You were not just fighting the Germans. You were trusting that the hydraulics in the landing gear would not fail you. The tail gunner faced backward. He saw where the plane had been. His primary threat was the Luftwaffe fighter, the Me-109 or Fu-190, coming in for a kill. He could see them, track them, and shoot them. It was a duel. The ball turret gunner had a different primary enemy, flak, Fliegerabwehrkanonen, anti-aircraft artillery. When a B-17 flew over a target like Berlin or Bremen, the Germans filled the sky with exploding steel. For the waist gunners, or the radio operator, flak was a sound, shrapnel pinging off the skin of the plane, or it was a puff of black smoke out the window. For the ball turret gunner, flak was a visual immersion. Because he was looking down, he saw the muzzle flashes of the cannons on the ground. He saw the shells racing upward. He saw the explosions beneath his feet. He was suspended in the center of the kill zone, and unlike the tail gunner, he had almost no armor. The tail gunner had a sheet of armored steel in front of him and bulletproof glass. The ball turret gunner sat behind a thin plate of armor, but his entire lower field of view was plexiglass. Plexiglass stops wind. It does not stop 20-millimeter cannon shells. It does not stop jagged steel shrapnel. The ball turret gunner was essentially floating in a fishbowl, surrounded by flying metal. Statistically, the casualty rates reflected this. While the waist gunners were often wounded by flak coming through the thin sides of the fuselage, the ball turret gunners suffered catastrophic injuries to their legs and lower torso. The experience of the ball turret gunner was so singular, so terrifying, that it inspired one of the most famous poems of World War 2. Randall Jarrell served in the Army Air Forces. He wrote a 5-line poem titled The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. It describes a gunner hunched in the belly of the state, freezing and isolated. The final line speaks of being washed out of the turret with a hose after death. It captures the brutal, industrial nature of this warfare. You became part of the machine. Technologically, the ball turret was a dead end. It was a necessary evil for a specific moment in time. By the end of the war, the B-29 Superfortress was introduced. The engineers had learned their lesson. The B-29 had guns on the belly, but no gunner sat inside them. The gunner sat in a pressurized, comfortable seat in the fuselage, looking through a blister window. He used a remote control sight to aim the guns. Computers calculated the lead. The era of the suicide sphere was over. But for 3 years, from 1940 to 1945, thousands of young American men, most of them barely out of high school, most of them standing 5'5", climbed into those glass bubbles. They were the smallest men on the crew. They had the tightest quarters. They had the coldest station. And they had the worst view of the war. When you look at photos of B-17 crews, you can usually spot the ball turret gunner. He is often the one in the front row, grinning, looking slightly smaller than the pilot standing behind him. But do not let the size fool you. To climb into that glass sphere, to curl up in the fetal position, to act as the human shield for the underside of a bomber while suspended over Nazi Germany. That required a stature that cannot be measured in feet and inches. This is the story of the ball turret gunner, the man in the bubble, the smallest soldier with the heaviest burden.